Hello, everyone. This is my first ever Pivrak and my first time in Lviv. I'm really happy to be here and just want to thank all of the organizers and for you guys for having me here today. Lviv has been awesome the last 24 hours. So this is my talk. It's called The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Technical Debt. And it's a kind of a nod towards this lady here. So I was talking with Sophia, one of the Pivrak organizers, about her yesterday, and she kind of gave me a little bit of a heads up and told me that maybe she's not that popular in Ukraine as much as she is in the UK and the States. So just out of curiosity, I'd just love to see a show of hands. Does anyone know who this woman is? Oh, okay, that's more than I expected. Well, her name is Kondo, and she's written a best-selling book called The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. And she also has a really popular Netflix hit show called Tidying Up. So for those of you that don't know who she is, Marie Kondo is somewhat of a global sensation. She is a tidying expert, she is a best-selling author, and she is the star of her own Netflix hit series and was named one of Time magazine's top 100 most influential people. And so she's really famous for helping people around the world to transform their cluttered homes into spaces of serenity and inspiration. And so she takes this whole concept of tidying to a whole new level in her book, teaching that if you simplify once, you'll never have to do it again. And so she forces us to examine our belongings and asks ourselves the question, does it spark joy, to help us decide what to keep and what to let go of? And so she pairs this philosophy of mindfulness and introspection with the practice of tidying through a specified series of steps or tidying lessons. And she calls it the KonMari method. And it's known to be really, really effective. And so very much like this talk I'm going to give you today, her books and her Netflix show is so much more than about tidying. It's about being intentional about what you choose to own and how that impacts the way you live, think, and perceive the world around you. And so technical debt is very much like the clutter that we have lying around our homes. And so while some people are really lucky to not work on code bases with technical debt, the reality for others is that it can play a huge role in slowing down development. As Marie Kondo would say, technical debt does not spark joy. All right, so the plan for this talk, we will begin by examining what exactly is technical debt. Oops. We will look to clean code versus tidy code, and then we will look at how we can apply the KonMari method to tidying away technical debt forever. So not too long ago, I stumbled across a really interesting paper about the big ball of mud pattern. And it was written in 1997 by two guys, Brian Foote and Joseph Yoder. And I would highly recommend everybody here to give it a read. It's really, really quite funny and really interesting. And it basically defines the big ball of mud as a sprawling, complex, tangled spaghetti code jungle. So does this architecture sound familiar to you? Well, it should, because big balls of mud are very, very common. We all know these kinds of systems. They're systems which many of us work in. They are systems which many of us use. And they are systems which maybe some of you are even creating right now. But how do they even exist in the first place? Well, the paper explains that because of business pressures, because of high developer turnover, and degrading designs, the big ball of mud is both inevitable and optimal, because software economics ultimately conspires against us. So especially at the early stages when time and money is in short supply. And so we end up ignoring architecture and performance and other best practices, and end up focusing on features and functionality. And so the structure was either never properly defined in the first place, or it's been eroded over time by unregulated growth, an onslaught of changing requirements, and repeated quick and dirty fixes. And so this whole quick and dirty approach, it often leads to these one-time use scripts, quick fixes, and silly workarounds ending up in a production code base. And so when we neglect it, our team members tend to neglect it too, because neglect is infectious. And so all common sense goes out of the window. New team members, for example, start to extend it, and this throwaway code, before we know it, becomes the big ball of mud. And so in order to tackle this problem, in order to tackle accumulated technical debt, we need to make a professional commitment to ourselves that we will not neglect the code. And part of this commitment is to actively seek out best practices and tools to help us achieve that. And one of these tools is clean code. So I'm not really going to go into too much detail about what clean code is. A lot has already been said on the subject, and you can look to a number of resources and information about this topic. There's plenty of it out there. Just to throw a number of names out there, you've got Sandy Metz, Kent Beck, and Robert Martin. They all know what they're talking about when it comes to clean code, and they are all pioneers in the field and have contributed towards clean code best practices. But for those of you who might be wondering, or might want a little quick refresher, let's just cover the main ideas really, really quickly. So when we talk about clean code, we talk about attaining 100% test coverage. We talk about writing short, reusable methods. We talk about choosing meaningful names, and object-oriented design, and refactoring. That's clean code. But the thing about the big ball of mud is that while using clean code principles can help largely tackle the problems, it only gets us partway there. So let me show you why. So I work at a company called Peg, which is a platform that connects brands to big Instagram stars. And so 5 years ago, this is pretty much what the business was all about. But fast forward 5 years, the business now needs to support not only Instagrammers, but also their representatives. So we're looking at talent agents, talent managers. It also needs to support brands using the platform for a variety of different features. So we introduced various subscription plans. And so as the business started to grow further, we started to hire for customer success teams and sales teams. And so they needed to know key metrics. And so we added various analytics platforms and also third-party integrations to help deal with that. So what do all of these business requirements look like in code? So let's go back in time again. So it's now 2014, and this is what one of Peg's endpoints looks like. So I'm showing you a really simple create action for a user's controller. So the idea is basically whenever a brand signs up to the platform, this controller action takes care of setting up that user in 2 lines of code. So really simple. This is day one. Again, let's fast forward 5 years, bearing in mind all of these new requirements. This is now the same controller endpoint. So please don't even try to read this. You will do a lot of damage to your eyesight. Yeah, fuck. So what the hell happened? This is one controller action. So what's happened is that to support the growth and evolution of the business, developers over time started to add to those 2 lines of code. So this code didn't just happen overnight. It took years, and it took a load of different people to contribute towards this. So what started as a really simple single user type slowly started to increase in complexity over time. So as I mentioned, we needed agents and we needed managers to also sign up to the platform with a special invitation code. Various analytics tools got integrated. So we also needed to send specific server errors to Airbrake. For some reason, we needed to capture each individual login into the database. We also needed to route new email addresses to third-party email marketing platforms for customer success teams. It needed to send Slack notifications for sales teams to keep track of. And it needed to confirm that certain product tours on the front end had been completed. So I'm sorry to show this to you again, but I mean, this code literally violates every single law in existence. It's an abomination, and it really should have been controlled. So what I'm showing you is definitely a very extreme example. And the point I want to make here is that we can use clean code principles, and we can improve this to a very large extent. For example, we can move various bits of logic into their respective models. We can clean up our variables. We can add tests. We can refactor. But ultimately, there is one flaw with this code. The complexity still remains. And so in redesigning and refactoring this code, we haven't really eliminated any of that underlying complexity. So we can change the look of this code, but we haven't actually thrown anything away. And this is what tidy code is all about. It's about making those really brutal decisions about what to keep and what to throw away. So question those underlying business decisions and any of that nonsense and garbage that's lying around in your code base, and find out if it's adding value, and then feel confident to delete it. This is how we tidy. So we need clean code, but we also need tidy code, and we need them both together. It's about becoming the Marie Kondo of code. So let's go back to her tidying method and try to glean a little bit more inspiration from there. Okay, so there are two main pillars to the KonMari method, which I'd like to focus on. And I believe these are the two most important guiding principles in achieving lasting tidiness in a code base. And so the first one is empathy, and the second one is discarding. So when we think about technical debt, we might not necessarily think about empathy. It's not really the first thing that comes to mind. And I realize that it might come as a bit of a surprise to talk about a soft skill in the context of technical debt. But if we think about it, there is a really strong correlation between messiness and shame. So here's like a really dumb example. So whenever my parents come to visit me in London and my home is a mess, I get really stressed out. I get very, very anxious about it. Or if I'm drying laundry in the living room and I get really embarrassed when my friends come over, I don't want them to see any of my underwear lying around, so I just put it in the bedroom, close the door, and I just pretend it doesn't exist. And so the coder experience is also very, very similar. So when you're onboarding new team members, for example, for sure there are areas of your code base that you don't want them to see. Or when you're working on legacy code or some code that some of your colleagues have written, it can be really hurtful and counterproductive to shame them for writing really bad code. Writing imperfect code is often times the reality of what we do. And so empathy is a really important part of ensuring that someone's work is met with kindness and respect. Or if somebody's reviewing your pull request, you might feel a bit anxious or not great about something lurking in the code. So just think about those times when you're reviewing a pull request or when you're working on legacy code. How do you approach other people's work? So I've frequently come across this comic over the years in various places, and I'm sure many of you guys have too. It says, the only valid measurement of code quality, WTFs per minute. And so I hold my hands up to this. We've all been there. I've also been very guilty of doing this. And for sure, there's a lot of truth to it. But if you put yourself in their shoes, so have you ever been at the receiving end of a WTF guy? Or are you the WTF guy? So this kind of response to code, it makes people a bit defensive. It triggers the whole fight or flight mechanism as a kind of stress response. And it's easy to feel attacked or shamed when the code you write isn't perfect. So if you're somebody in a position to improve technical debt in your company, don't be a bull in a china shop about it. Bring empathy and kindness to everything that you do, because without it, the stuff I'm going to be talking about later, the more practical techniques, will not work. So to create that culture free of technical debt, we need to practice empathy every single day. So in 1999, Andrew Hunt and Dave Thomas wrote about the pragmatic programmer. 10 years later, in 2009, Chad Fowler came out with The Passionate Programmer. And chances are you've all heard of these books. They are classics in our industry. They regularly feature on top 10 lists. But fast forward another 10 years later, and we're now in 2019. And much of the content in these books is still very much relevant. It still holds up decades later. So we've looked to pragmatism and passion to drive our careers forward in software development. What other qualities or traits do we now look to? So I'd go so far as to say that empathy is the most important skill that we can add to our tool belts. 2019, we should call it the year of the empathetic programmer. And I'd argue that as programmers, empathy is necessary to building better software and creating more impactful teams. Without it, we are all destined to wallow in that big ball of mud. Okay, so back to the KonMari method. So we've talked about empathy. The second pillar to it is discarding. Arguably, this is the part that she is most famous for. We will now refer back to this as deleting. So Marie Kondo has a bunch of techniques for making a home tidy. She teaches us folding techniques. She shows us how to cleverly store our clothes. She shows us how to categorize and group items together so you can find them more easily later on. But we can spend the rest of our lives continually doing these activities, but ultimately nothing is going to change unless we start to throw things away. And so guess what? It's exactly the same thing with code. So as developers, we can spend our valuable time refactoring, TDD, abstracting away complexity, but ultimately the complexity will always remain unless we cull our code base. Deleting code is good because all code is bad. So what do I mean by this? So as developers, we all love to code. We're writing to deliver value. That's our jobs. That's what we're hired to do. And the code is what we use to do that. But the more we write, the more surface area there is for breakage, and the more costs there are to maintain it. And so it's the feature value that we provide that is the true asset. The code itself is a liability. And so we want to maximize the value from features, but minimizing the amount of code that we write. And if there's a poor ratio, it's strongly symptomatic that you have a technical debt problem. So if we can logically reason that less code is better, then deleting code should be a huge part of what we're hired to do. It's as important as writing code. So I love this feeling. When you create a pull request and the number of lines removed exceeds the number of lines that you've added. As Marie Kondo would say, it sparks joy. Code deletion is a celebration. So in the same way that discarding your worldly possessions can be a very difficult thing to do, deleting code can also be really tough. And it's the same ideas that prevent us from letting go. So the first one is attachment. So as developers, we tend to attach a lot of feelings to our code because we care a lot about it. And so attachment to software is often said to cause great suffering because of how interlinked it is to our emotions. So if somebody else wants to change the code that you've spent time and effort on, how does that make you feel? And so empathy, what I talked about earlier, is strongly linked to dealing with attachment because we need to understand and believe that people are doing the best they can. Given what they knew at the time, given their skills and given their abilities, the resources available, and the situation at hand. And so empathy is also crucial to being kind to yourself, just realizing that you are not the code that you write. The second thing that stops us from deleting is uncertainty. And so oftentimes, we can come across code that looks a little bit like this. So why is 2/3 of this method commented out? Is the new way of doing things better than the old way of doing things? are we planning to go back to the old way of doing things anytime soon? So it's better to delete the redundant code because it adds extra noise and confusion. And so we can turn to a bunch of dynamic analysis tools such as Coverband, just one of many Ruby gems out there, to help us hunt down dead code. The third thing that stops us from deleting could be fear. So again, has anybody ever come across code that looks a little bit like this, where you just take one look at it and you just slowly back away? So sometimes the code can look quite intimidating. So instead of fearing the code, instead go and find out who wrote it, check the commit history for any context, start to ask questions. Ignoring code like this is what leads to an untidy code base. The fourth thing that stops us from deleting code is code that we might need again later. So this kind of code in a production code base literally makes no sense whatsoever. And it sounds so obvious, but we should be relying really heavily on source control. So if you want to store random snippets of code, old implementations, or resurrect a deprecated feature, just don't leave it in the code base. We can make it really easy to recover deleted code by writing specific commits for deletion and labeling them properly so it's easily retrievable later in Git. Or an obvious one. And then the last thing that stops us from deleting code is that maybe it's just way too big. And this one is definitely the most difficult one to deal with. And so the key to this is writing code in the first place that's easy to delete. So start to write deletable code. So for areas of the code base that are too large to delete, we can start by refactoring. So refactor in order to decouple and isolate dependencies, refactor to break backwards compatibility. Then delete the rest that we don't need. If you start deleting code with this perspective, it'll start to have a profound effect on how you write code. You'll start to write deletable code, because you'll want code that's really easy to delete. And code that's easy to delete is small and it's isolated. And all of a sudden, you'll discover that technical debt doesn't really matter anymore. Because if you need to ship something really quickly, it's not really an issue if the code is imperfect. Because next time somebody else works on that piece of code, they'll feel free to delete it without any hesitation or uncertainty. Because it's easy and because we are empathetic towards each other. So with all of these techniques, it's my hope that you will start to enjoy deleting code if you don't already. And when there's less of it, you can truly start to appreciate the code that you have left. With all of that noise and uncertainty gone, you'll start to see the benefits of a tidy code base. The KonMari method encourages us to express gratitude to our belongings before we get rid of them. So basically this means thanking each item for serving its purpose before we throw it away. So next time you tackle technical debt, thank the code for all of its hard work, hit backspace, and then let it go. And this is the life-changing magic of tidying. Thank you. Oh, questions.
Raise your hand, say your name, and ask your question.
Or you can find me afterwards, and we can have a Q&A then.
There's a question over here, 1 second.
Oh, okay.
First of all, thank you for coming to Leap, and thank you for the talk. I have a question not connected to the code, rather, at your company, do you have a special compulsory routine when you all come together as a team and every week, every month, decide what to delete? Or you do it all by your own, on your own?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Is it still working? Yeah. So, I mean, over the years, we've tried like a ton of different things. It's quite interesting that you ask, because at the moment we're at a stage, the company's at the stage where we have been upgrading a lot of our new technologies. And so what we found to be the most effective solution for us is to kind of have this simultaneous two kind of two simultaneous builds going on at the same time. So we've tackled technical debt by essentially rewriting most of our software and killing off all of the features. So I touched on stuff like coverband, which is a Ruby gem that helps you find dead code. So we've used something like Skylight, for example, which helped us find out which of our various endpoints aren't in use and then got us to reassess exactly what to delete. So in terms of processes, I think we're going to start to approach that in a very different way now that we've got a new code base. But our approach right now has just been to delete everything, start from scratch, which I realize might not be the best way for most people, but that's what we've been doing at PEG.
Yes, thank you for your talk. Yeah, sorry. My question is, do you use Rubocop, and how is it helpful for keeping the code clean and tidy?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I personally haven't used Rubocop before, but from what I understand, I guess it uses a lot of like the Ruby community best practices to discover which parts of your code base are basically violating those rules. Mm-hmm.
At most 100 lines per class,
Yeah.
and at most 10 lines per entire method.
Yeah.
So like you won't get those big things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess having a culture of empathy, what I talked about when reviewing each other's code, has been really crucial. But also, I guess, kind of approaching code from the perspective that you're then going to delete it, which kind of forces you to write things in a really small way. Yeah.
One more question, do we have?
Hi again. Can you describe a biggest fuck up after what caused by deleting code?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Can you describe a biggest fuck up? The biggest fuck up,
Oh,
which caused by deleted code.
wait, so the biggest fuck up
Yeah.
caused by deleting code?
Yeah.
That is an amazing question. So does anybody have a story of deleting code that caused a huge fuck up at the company?
I have a very quick story where we had excellent code coverage, test coverage, where that, whatever reason, didn't even touch the user model. So somebody deleted the user model, all the test passes, and we did deploy.
Yeah. Great answer.
Hey, guys, let's get a warm round of applause for Sroop.